and good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to host you in another seminar of the Theories of Regulation series, this time on emphasis on technology. And with us today, Irina Brass, Dr. Irina Brass. She's Associate Professor in Regulation, Innovation, and Public Policy at the UCL Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy. She specializes in regulation of emergent technologies and the governance of responsible regulation. She's a member of the PETRAS IoT Center of Excellence in Cybersecurity. She's leading a project there, and she's also co-investigator in the future of targeted healthcare manufacturing hub, looking at new regulatory approaches for advanced therapeutics. Now, Irina works closely with the government department on regulatory agencies and standard developing organization on issues pertaining to cybersecurity, safety, resilience, data protection. She's in 2017, she was appointed chair of the IoT Technical Committee of the British Standard Institution. And in 2019, she received the prestigious BCI Standard Makers Award for education about standardization. Last year, 2020, she won the UCL Provost Education Award for research-led teaching and learning. So both a researcher, excellence in research, excellence in teaching, and a good academic citizens. Irina will talk today on agile, anticipatory, and adaptive regulatory responses for technology disruptions and scientific innovations. Irina, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and very importantly for the opportunity to present my work today. And also importantly, thank you to all of you who have taken time during your afternoons or evenings or morning, depending on where you are in the world, to join this session. I hope it is insightful and we can have a good discussion at the end. I'll try to keep the presentation to about 30 minutes. So now, if it's okay with everyone, I will just share my my screen and put the presentation. So thank you very much for joining. Again, I hope you hear me okay too. So as David mentioned, today I will be talking about some of the ongoing work that I've been doing for a while now, looking at regulatory responses to technology disruptions and scientific innovations, and in particular, sort of that I categorize as agile, anticipatory, and adaptive. Moving forward to the next slide. In terms of what I would like to cover today is I will start by providing, if you wish, a context or the motivation that informed this ongoing research and interest that I have in this area, that very much is grounded in some changes that have happened in recently in policy discourse around putting an emphasis on regulatory agility, adaptation, and anticipation. So what I will do before I move on to the actual research is I will present some of this concept and some of the gaps that I've identified in this policy discourse that essentially provides, if you wish, the why there is demand and interest from a policy perspective in creating, setting more agile, adaptive, anticipatory regulatory frameworks. And then what I will do is I will focus on the research scope, which is very much to question or to ask, are these regulatory initiatives that we are seeing really genuinely regulatory innovations? If so, do they have new novel features, regulatory structures? Do they propose new regulatory structures when it comes to the relationship between the regulator, regulated entities, and other intermediaries, for instance? Approaches to the regulatory governance, do we see new ones? Is there an overlap with previous regulatory reforms and approaches that we've seen throughout the years? And in order to answer these questions, what I have done is I've conducted a systematic literature review. I'm still working on it. There was a paper that I circulated, a draft that I circulated as part of the RegGov conference last month, and I will soon post a working paper updating those findings as well. But it's very important to note that, again, this is very much work in progress, and what I will do is I will present some preliminary findings from this systematic literature review, and I will also identify and share with you some of the gaps that I've identified that I think are critical for our scholarship in regulation and governance moving forward. So I mentioned at the start that we've seen, or I've identified some changes in the current policy discourse, and really from around sort of 2015 onwards, more or less, what we've seen is a change in this discourse at domestic and international level focused on a regulatory policy reform around the realization that the technological and scientific innovations that we are seeing at the moment are quite disruptive in nature, and as a result require different approaches. And if you wish, one iconic piece of writing in this space is by the founder and executive chair of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, who in 2016 wrote the book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, arguing that essentially with the 21st century, we are really entering into a new a new era, a fourth industrial revolution that is very much characterized by, on the one hand, a lot of emphasis on digital technologies and processes like sensors, algorithmic decision-making tools, the Internet of Things, but also, very importantly, merging, if you wish, of what originally were quite siloed, quite discrete industry sectors. So the merging of the digital, of the physical, and of the biological sphere. So in this context, what has recently happened, and I'm providing here two very recent publications, one by the World Economic Forum just in December 2020, where they set up this toolkit for regulators, really advocating agile regulation for the fourth industrial revolution, and also the last image that you're seeing, this Agile Charters Agile Nations Charter, excuse me, which essentially it's a number of countries, Canada, Denmark, Japan, Italy, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom that have set up this legally non-binding cooperation agreement to establish an intergovernmental network to foster cooperation on rulemaking with a mission to make it easier for businesses within their jurisdiction to introduce and scale innovations across their market, while upholding protections for citizens and the environment. And this is a quote. And what you can see in paragraph 4A is again a focus on anticipating and identifying innovations and the opportunities as well as the risks they present in a timely manner. So first, if you wish, policy, not necessarily a gap, but an issue that we found is, yes, this policy discourse noting the highly disruptive nature of technological and scientific innovations that blur these boundaries between established industry and organizational silos, and as a result of that require more agile, anticipatory regulatory responses. And indeed, just from the introduction that David did, what I also noticed in the research projects that I work on, and I'm very fortunate in the work that I'm doing to really look at regulatory, the need for regulatory change when it comes to most of the technologies that are mentioned as part of supposedly, yes, this fourth industrial revolution that we're seeing here. So Internet of Things, connected devices that are now available in our home, on us, in our ambient environments or our critical infrastructures, as well as, for instance, biotechnological innovations such as cell and gene therapies, for instance, vaccines, innovations, etc., as well as in the interactions, for instance, that I am experiencing as part of an academic that is also heavily involved in standards making. So what I noticed just through the interactions with the researchers and the practitioners in my research portfolio as well is that across key stakeholders, from government departments to regulatory agencies to intermediaries to industry, there is this recognition that we need more agility, adaptation, flexibility, reflexivity, etc., however we want to call it. However, these terms are used very often interchangeably and mean different things to different people. So what I started doing before conducting the systematic literature review of academic publications is I wanted to essentially review the policy documents, so documents that from government strategies to international fora, policy papers, for instance, etc., to see what are they identifying as, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, as you're looking at the screen, the rationales for that require this agility, adaptation, and anticipation on the one hand, and on the right-hand side of your screen, how do these policy papers essentially interpret what we mean by agility, anticipation, and adaptation? So very briefly walking through this, what I noticed is that in terms of the rationales that are being provided, contemporary technological and scientific innovations are perceived as, first of all, generating not just opportunities, not just known risks, but increasingly unknown risks and uncertainty. And a result of this, the argument in these policy documents is that we are experiencing, yes, the pacing, the traditional regulatory pacing problem, and questioning the fit for purpose of existing regulations. The second aspect when it comes to that is identified as a rationale when it comes to these contemporary technological and scientific innovations. For instance, here, if we're thinking of the emergence of very complex cyber-physical systems, for instance, in critical infrastructures, right? So critical infrastructures that increasingly have not just their physical identity that might require, for instance, safety considerations, but also cybersecurity. So that these technological and scientific innovations reinforce tightly coupled, complex, interdependent, and sometimes even transboundary systems. So we're talking here about complex adaptive systems that essentially, yes, require adaptive regulatory and governance responses, a bit like in the law of requisite variety, right? Complex systems require complex solutions. And that, of course, here we're looking at the sort of traditional coordination, regulatory coordination problem, in the sense that we see a misalignment of risk regulatory regimes, sometimes siloed and focused on a particular issue, as I said, safety, for instance, cybersecurity, and how do these these regulatory regimes speak to each other? And importantly, also as an area of concern, that sometimes these technological and scientific innovations are provided as solutions in response to global crisis, for instance, COVID-19 in this case. if we're thinking of track and trace system, and as a result of them, they require expedited regulatory responses. When it comes to just reviewing the policy papers for now, in terms of the three strategies that are being proposed and in terms of their key features, just as a summary, agile regulation is generally perceived as being based on experimentation, outcomes-based approaches to regulatory reform, and an interest into managing different risk profile, the quite diverse risk profile of participating businesses and the regulated entities in the end. Anticipatory regulation still has, within the policy papers that I reviewed, a focus on experimentation, also as with agile regulation, on outcomes-based principles, and this idea of test and evolve, yes, rather than solve and leave. Adaptive regulation is interesting. Some papers it is associated, some policy papers it is associated with experimentation, but there is an emphasis also, which is unique to the other two, to agile and anticipation, on the regulatory governance requirements that are needed to capture new information about emerging risks. So going into and very much responding to these issues about unknown risks triggered by technological innovations. Where do regulatory sandboxes fit in? George asked. In agile and anticipatory regulation, in most cases, and as I said, this is the answer based on the policy papers that I reviewed. So, or international fora documentation, strategies, etc. So, of course, you might say, as I did, and this motivated the research further, and the literature review that the academic systematic literature review that I'll share the findings with you in a second. Haven't we seen some of these features before? I know that most of us here are very much aware of these different types of regulatory changes, innovations that we have seen throughout the years, both in practice and in the theory of regulation and governance. But, and just to prove the point here, and also to kind of respond even further with proof to George, if we look at the toolkit for regulators, we see that it's very much outcomes focused, experimental, data driven, self and co-regulation, joined up government or joined up regulation, etc. So yes, agile regulation, but within the toolkit, we very much have elements of the other approaches, of the other regulatory innovations that we've seen before. So the third kind of gap that I've identified is, okay, it is not clear whether these proposals for agility, adaptation, anticipation are in fact regulatory innovations or are umbrella terms for the essentially toolkits of existing approaches and innovations that we've seen in the field. Because when it comes to, and this is the sort of second leg of the third challenge that I've identified, because when it comes to talking in more depth about the design, the structure, the implementation, the monitoring arrangements, so the entire regulatory governance regime needed to support these adaptive, anticipatory, agile regulations, policy papers don't necessarily go into this detail. So what I did is I decided to then go to the academic literature and see, do we, first of all, do we confirm what are the main features of agile, anticipatory, and adaptive regulatory approaches from the sort of assumptions in policy to what is happening in the scholarship? And importantly, what regulatory design and governance approaches do they recommend to respond to emerging techno-scientific risks and uncertainties? So to kind of fill this gap that doesn't exist, that currently exists or is not covered in policy papers themselves when it comes to the design, the instrument choices, the structures, the monitoring, etc., that is associated with these particular forms of regulatory reform, if you want to call them, and importantly, what are the similarities and differences between these new approaches and previous reforms. So, very briefly, and in the interest of time, what I have done, I will probably be about 10-15 more minutes. Is that's okay, David?
Yes,
I will try to keep it as short as possible. So I've conducted a systematic literature review in the Campbell tradition of systematic literature review. So I've done a review protocol. I've limited the search to peer-reviewed academic publications from 2000 to 2021 in June. That's what I'm capturing here. In terms of the inclusion criteria, I've looked only at studies that discuss regulatory reforms from an agility, anticipation, adaptation, flexibility perspective, but very much linked to technical and scientific innovations. So not just all of them in general, but there must be some element of technical and scientific innovation, emerging risks associated with them, uncertainty in the papers to be included. And I've presented here very briefly the search syntax that I've used to then query a number of databases. So far I queried the 3 databases available here. In total, there were about 1,000 papers, 1,000 academic publications, articles that dealt with this, so that essentially met the initial search. That came out of the initial search. And from that, what I've done is I've removed the duplicates, and I've also screened for further eligibility based on the inclusion criteria at title, at keyword, and at abstract level, the other papers, so all the papers. And in total, what I came up with is a number of 77 publications that I then further categorized into 34 adaptive, so publications that look at adaptive regulation and governance for techno-scientific innovations, anticipatory regulation and governance, so looking at anticipatory frameworks 20. And then I created this new category, kind of like techno-scientific risks, uncertainty, and complexity, 29 papers that essentially mention either adaptation or anticipation, but don't make it in the techno-scientific innovations context, but don't necessarily make it the kind of critical focus of the paper. You will notice that there is no paper on agility. There was one paper that came, and it also that came out of the search, and it was also in the category of sort of anticipatory regulation. So some of the papers deal with both adaptation and anticipation. That's why, if you're looking at why the 3 don't add up to 77, it's because some have been duly categorized as well. So the key findings overall. So if we're looking just at the papers that address adaptive regulation, what I've identified is that when it comes to adaptive regulatory approaches and practices, the area that we see this, or the areas that we see these appear in studies, are generally in digital tech, in pharmaceuticals, and in climate adaptation. There were some in energy as well, some in transport. But very importantly, they focus on how to update existing rules in accordance with changes and advances in science and technology knowledge, so new knowledge. And this is a very important aspect to emphasize. They borrow some of the features from the self-governance literature, the ones that are dealing with complex adaptive systems, overcoming collective action problems. And very importantly, some of them, not all of them, but most of them carry this underlying assumption, yes, when we talk about when they describe adaptive regimes, regulatory regimes, on the performance of a risk versus risk assessment. So this is identifying the risk of essentially encouraging a particular innovation versus evaluated against the risk of it proving harmful. So what are the two, or throughout the literature that I reviewed, the papers that I reviewed, when it comes to adaptive regulation, we see two distinctive features. First of all, the first feature is the creation of expedited pathways, regulatory pathways, as a way of bringing innovation more quickly on the market. And very good examples here are from the pharmaceutical, healthcare and pharmaceutical case studies, applications. So mostly in the issuing of licensing for new medicinal products and pharmaceutical innovations. So that's sort of one distinctive feature of what adaptive regulation means from the papers that I reviewed. And the second one is this emphasis on iteratively updating and adjusting science and technology policy and regulation as new data becomes available. And as you can see from the quote that I provided here, and if I just sort of move along it, yes, it's key stakeholders, so it's an emphasis on not just the regulator and the regulated industry, but broader stakeholders and entities involved in these regimes. To keep pace with evolving nature of emerging technologies research by, and this is very important, adapting, among other things, the kind of data they use, so adaptation of data, analytic techniques, regulatory instruments, and guidelines. And one very good example of this is the planned adaptive risk regulation. So as new knowledge about scientific or technological risk emerges, then your regulatory, your risk regulatory regime is planned to adapt. And we can talk a little bit more about it in the discussion as well. Yes, those regimes are designed to facilitate the introduction of new, and the generation and introduction of new risk knowledge for rule adaptation. When it comes to the challenges identified in the literature, so there are quite a few challenges that are identified in the literature, and I do have to say that most of the literature actually focuses with the challenges associated with both challenges in both adaptive and anticipatory frameworks. The challenges that are identified, I classified as almost sort of three of them. First of all is a realization of the complexity and the political, that more needs to be investigated when it comes to the complexity and the politics of these relations between, yes, when it comes to the provision and also the diffusion of this information in these adaptive risk regimes. The question of institutional capacity. Yes, in order to have these agile processes, we need human resource expertise, information infrastructure, time capital, for instance, and a lot of the literature mentions these institutional capacity deficits and challenges. And also, quite importantly, an emphasis on the importance of focusing less on instruments and more on regulatory governance approaches, the clarity of the regulatory targets, the identification of the correct regulatory target and clarity around that, the nature of the process, and of course the deliberative and participatory aspects associated there. Now, when it comes to the literature that specifically spoke about techno-scientific innovations, risks, opportunities, etc., associated with them through the lens of anticipatory regulation, here very much the focus is not so much on sort of knowledge generation, creation, and rule adaptation, but more on the creation of experimental legal regimes and practices. So our traditional sort of sandboxes, policy experiments, Interestingly, there was less focus on the sort of recursive process of testing, learning, and policy adaptation that comes with the whole experimental regulation and the experimentalist governance literature that we have seen. And some of the challenges here that are identified in the literature that I reviewed so far are again critical issues around the balancing act that regulators and policymakers have to do when it comes to encouraging innovation and promoting the long-term public interest. Very importantly, also issues around epistemic difficulties. So if we talk about the provision of or the creation of these experimental legal regimes, the epistemic knowledge that supports that, especially when it comes to rule design and then the structure overall, and sometimes the contentious values associated with them, or the values associated with them are, or the normative claims that underpin this knowledge that comes from the epistemic, from epistemic communities in these anticipatory regulatory frameworks is a challenge, and it has been identified as a challenge in the literature that I reviewed. And of course, very similar, if you wish, to adaptive regulation, these organizational challenges that require to build capacity for anticipation. So overall, when it comes to, and this is my second to last slide. When it comes to the preliminary findings, so mostly from a theoretical perspective, so far that I have identified by reviewing, by conducting the systematic literature review. So there is a clear difference between adaptive regulatory approaches and anticipatory regulatory approaches that is emerging from the literature. The first one focusing mostly on the iterative procedures of evidence gathering, new knowledge generation, and rule adjustment. So that's for adaptive regulation, whereas anticipatory regulatory approaches focus mostly on experimentation, on the tools and techniques used to govern or to introduce and govern techno-scientific innovations and their risks, such as futures and foresight, sandboxes, trials, policy experiments, etc. There is an overlap, although it's not necessarily stated, but it sort of appears in some of the papers with the reflexive regulation and experimental regulation, as I noted earlier. But interestingly, not so much is captured in the academic literature, at least not the one that I've reviewed, focusing on the features, if you wish, of smart and better regulation, right, issues around proportionality, around cost-benefit analysis, around transparency, around accountability, for instance. So less focus on that. There are also some clear links to co-regulation, some to self-regulation as well. In these, obviously, these complex risk regulatory regime require enhanced co-regulation, and some papers do hint and point to that. But interestingly, not a lot contest the assumption that the regulator is present. But what the emphasis is across both adaptive and anticipatory regulatory approaches is this focus on, now we have a large number of entities involved in these new regulatory structures that have to support these innovations, right? So it's not just regulator and target anymore. And the papers also raise awareness about the importance of regulatory design, structure, and governance arrangements, but more needs to, there is a gap in the current literature on how these arrangements occur in practice. What are the implications for these entities involved? And some articles that I've reviewed deal with these, but not necessarily in understanding how these regimes are actually formed. Finally, and I'll finish on this slide, and thank you for staying with me for 7 more minutes. There are some clear gaps for further research that it would be great to discuss with you now in the Q&A as well, and in our discussion. So first of all, from my perspective, more investigation into academic investigation into how these regulatory frameworks operate in practice needs to be done in a systematic manner, comparative manner, or as a single case. But there is really a lot that is still missing when it comes to what it means to have these regulations in practice. There is a gap here also, in my view, when it comes to evaluating and understanding the implementation challenges that are associated with these regulatory innovations, if you want to call them that. Changes to structure, regulatory orchestration, role of regulatory intermediaries in these very quite complex systems that require a lot of agility and knowledge generation, constant knowledge generation, review, learning quickly, etc., etc. The epistemic communities that are needed to support that. And also two other gaps. First of all, the capacity deficits. So more work needs to be done on understanding what the capacity deficits are. If we are to create these regulatory governance regimes that are, as I mentioned, quite complex, what is the distribution of institutional and organizational capacity across not just regulated entity, but all of the other, all of the ecosystem of entities, third parties, or entities that just provide, for instance, that knowledge, information, when it comes to these systems. And very importantly, because we started by, I started the presentation by showing you, the Agile Nations Charter and the WEF toolkit. The politics, more needs to be done when it comes to the politics of these regulatory reforms. So there is a lot more to be done in this space. Yeah, thank you. I look forward to your questions. And if you would like to see the paper, I'm very happy to share the paper that I shared at RegGov as well. So please do get in touch, and I'll be very happy to share the paper more broadly. And very soon I will be by the end of the month for sure. There will be a working paper that will be available online, so I can share that with David to put on the YouTube channel.
Thank you very much, Irina. Time for Q&A. Excellent presentation. And now you, the audience, are most welcome to join the discussion. Who wants to start? I don't see all the ends, so please don't hesitate to come in even without my. I see you, Edward.
Oh, you do, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now I see you. Yes, please.
Yes, more of a comment than anything else. Up until the beginning of your presentation, I thought I was an expert in regulatory governance, having worked as a parliamentary counsel for 25 years and having examined and advised governments in 30 countries. I realized that there's as much to learn as I've already seen. One of the things that struck me is the challenge of the concept of agile and adaptive regulations, because those terms, for lawyers at least, are inconsistent. Regulation has to be stable and coherent. On the other hand, we're in a world where things are changing rapidly. And I think the conclusion that your paper is heading towards is that there's a great need to change institutional arrangements, because currently they're not adapted to the kind of developments that are taking place around us. The only place that I've seen it work in practice is in relation to sandboxes for licenses. That seems to have worked in some places, like in Mauritius, although I'm going to look at that more closely shortly, and in Singapore. But a lot of the points that you made are fundamental to regulatory governance, such as the need for better evaluation, and that in turn requires better competence on the part of those who are involved, both at the political level, where a lot of them don't know anything at all except how to get re-elected, but also at the technical level, the public servants. There are huge capacity deficits, and there are capacity deficits in developed countries. And you can imagine where what happens in countries that are much less developed. And I'm very interested, I must say, to learn more. So I look forward to reading your paper and seeing the details. I'm afraid I have no questions. I'm just overwhelmed by the.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Irina, do you want to
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I think Edward, you're spot on in the sense that yes, probably one of the main challenges for the practice as well as for the theory of regulatory governance, especially in the space when we talk about adaptation, agility, etc., is the more focus on the institutional arrangements that support these very agile mechanisms. So yes, absolutely spot on there. From an anticipatory regulatory perspective, yes, you're right that sandboxes in some places have worked and have worked successfully. We've seen them deployed in financial sector, and now a lot of countries, for instance, are also considering the introduction of sandboxes for cryptocurrencies. For instance, we see them when it comes to particular analytic algorithmic decision-making tools, for instance, or algorithmic decision-making system machine learning tools used across a number of sectors. But even there, more needs to be done into understanding what makes for a successful sandbox. How does it have to be? What's the legal framework, the legislative legal framework that supports them? For instance, in some places there is one, in some places there isn't necessarily one. And then also to reflect a bit more on those on the learning and the learning processes that are taking place. From an adaptive regulations perspective, we've seen this, and I mentioned planned adaptive risk regulation, and we've seen this work, but there in some cases. So for instance, I'm thinking here of some colleagues that worked at deltas and the management of dikes, safety issues around dikes in the Netherlands, for instance, where essentially there are thresholds. There is a continuous monitoring of the resilience of those dikes, and the moment that particular thresholds are hit, that information is automatically being provided to the regulator for rule adaptation. But very importantly here, for the planned adaptive risk regulation regimes to work, they need to have a very active regulator. The law itself has to specify a requirement for new knowledge generation to be provided, right, to essentially codify it somehow. And more needs to be done to understand the stakeholders and the epistemic communities that then support to provide this evidence. So we see this happen very often in cybersecurity. And if you think of internet security and the internet as a very complex transnational infrastructure, to manage the security of this also requires epistemic knowledge from a number of expert communities. So not just even the sort of quasi-formalized regulatory intermediaries that exist in these in technology and science risk regulatory regimes in general.
And now we move to Johannes and then to George. Johannes, please.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Johannes Bauer from Michigan State University. Thanks for your interesting talk. Unfortunately, I missed a few minutes at the beginning, so you may have talked about this. So apologies if that's the case. So in some sense, right, adaptive regulation has been adaptive from its beginning. It was introduced to have some more adaptive institution, and I think what we are seeing is sort of a need because of different industrial processes to shorten the adaptation cycle, to deal with other issues. One aspect, and you really summarized it very, very eloquently. One aspect that you didn't dig into, at least in this part that I could monitor, is is the role of uncertainty, right? And in the especially among engineers, there's a lot of discussion now about different types of uncertainty, right? So we move from situations of risk. So for example, the dike may be a situation where we know approximately what could happen, right? We just don't know when and how. And so monitoring gives us enough feedback, as opposed to, let's say, artificial intelligence, where there may be deep uncertainty, where we literally cannot establish either individual Bayesian uncertainties about what might happen, right? So the notion of risk and optimization collapses. And I was wondering whether you looked at those dimensions of uncertainty in your work, and whether there's differences in how regulation is envisioned in those circumstances.
Thank you very much.
Should I come in now?
Yeah.
Okay.
As you want.
Thanks for a great talk. So I have two questions. One is, I've done some research on regulatory sandboxes as well, and I got interested in the subject. And what I've seen is that there is also a lot of cheap talk sometimes happening. So regulators are saying they are innovative, just, you know, to claim that they are open for business, and in reality they are not. Sorry, I seem to have a problem with my camera. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So there is sometimes a problem in the sense that, you know, so do you see the same thing happening, that sometimes regulators are implementing the stuff that you're talking about, and in reality it's just a sort of marketing gag to attract innovative technologies, or, you know, in my field, you know, fintechs, for example, to come to your country because it's seen as a good marketing story. Yes, we are innovative, we are adaptive, and all those nice things. And the second question I have is, there is another dimension that you didn't mention, and I think I call this the mutual learning effect between the regulatory techniques that you talked about, because I think it's not so much just reducing the time to market sort of for the innovative industry perspective, but there's also benefit for the regulator in learning about the innovative technology itself. So I think it's sort of a learning process on both sides going on, this dialogue between regulators and regulatees, and I wonder how that fits into your story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see in the chat, but I might be mistaken, the first question, the first question that was asked.
Yeah. I can help you if needed. Deridesh asked now in writing if you have some thought about the clash of cultures when those who are target of regulation do not want to be regulated. This is quite true in the cryptocurrency world, at least part of the cryptocurrency world. And then the question of participation, how those people who do not want regulation participate anyway. So I hope I delivered the thrust of the question.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. And thank you for the clarification, and my apologies. So very quickly to respond to this, and some of the, I should say that some of my responses will be based on my own sort of experience of researching in this space, and I'll also reflect to what has come out of the systematic literature review as much as I can. So from the systematic literature review perspective, that hasn't, this issue of institutional clashes, culture clashes, hasn't necessarily emerged. Of course, to a certain extent, in the practice of it, this goes beyond just sort of what the regulated entities want or don't want, but it's sometimes even a culture clash when it comes to, and coming back to the last question, when it comes to that mutual learning effect and knowledge exchange, a preparation on the part of those who are contributing knowledge to these adaptive regulatory regimes to also be able to share it and be willing to share it. So to a certain extent, and this is where I'm reflecting on the interactions that I've had with, I don't know, representatives of government departments, not just in the UK, but more broadly, regulators in the UK, EU, for instance. There is a recognition that regulation is needed here, regardless of whether the regulated entity wants it or not, to a certain extent. That the task itself is quite literally unmanageable, and that if left to just market mechanisms or self-regulatory mechanisms. So I think that we've moved a little bit, I would say, in the discourse across policy also, and policymakers, when it comes to self-regulation works quite well. Let's see what happens to more co-regulatory approaches. So I hope that I responded at least in part to your question. Now going back to the second question about, well, regulation has always been adaptive to a certain extent. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But typically conventional sort of approaches would mean there is some need for regulatory change, and then you will have, you will put a consultation forward, and then, the potential regulated industry, or the regulated industry, if it's not a new legislation per se, but an adaptation, would then provide input to that consultation, and then the law might change or not, capturing those. But that's a very kind of linear model, right? We're not talking about that sort of degree of sort of linearity, and also that in itself is not a very agile model too, right? Generally those consultations can take 2-3 years, 4 years, etc., sometimes even 5 years for that change to be done. So the question here, when it comes to the adaptation, and especially responding to emerging risks and uncertainties associated with, for instance, issues of cybersecurity, algorithmic decision making, as you noted, is how do you plan and codify, as I mentioned before, how do you plan and codify these processes in law, in the regulation, these processes of constant knowledge generation? I'm thinking here because I work a lot in cybersecurity, so I can provide here the example of, so cybersecurity is essentially an area where there are some known risks, but there are also always emerging risks and some critical uncertainties that are associated with that when it comes to the impact that some cybersecurity breaches, for instance, can have on critical infrastructures, the internet's infrastructures per se, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in those cases, for instance, what we noticed in the work that myself and my colleague Jesse Sowell did recently, and a paper that we published in Regulation and Governance, is we looked, for instance, we took the example of ENISA. This is the cybersecurity agency in the European Union, who has a mechanism has created mechanisms, or a platform, for instance, where anyone can report a cybersecurity vulnerability, and it's a live platform that essentially provides a space for any cybersecurity researcher, anyone who has been essentially who identifies some particular challenges, to go and report that. So to provide that knowledge to the regulator, so that the regulator then can adapt its requirements, essentially, that are placed on the regulated entities. That part, how that adaptation takes place, that's probably one of the weaknesses in the Cybersecurity Act. But what we see with ENISA is having done this, at least in practice, when it comes to creating that space for that data gathering and knowledge generation that then can inform the any rule change or any requirement change, right? Third question, mutual learning effect. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. To a certain extent, I hope I answered it. But one of the fundamental and critical challenges that we are seeing, and that I have seen through the research that I've done so far, especially on IoT, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, safety, critical resilience issues, etc., data protection, is that the knowledge that is derived, so the knowledge again that is needed to support such adaptation beyond the requirement for those institutional arrangements to exist, is the fact that epistemic communities themselves, first of all, it requires a large number of epistemic communities that specialize in different areas. So we're not just talking about some engineers. No, we're talking about cybersecurity experts, data protection lawyers, etc., etc. So epistemic communities that have diverse set of knowledge, and sometimes they want to share it, sometimes they don't want to share that knowledge. Constantly sharing that knowledge is also a problem. And when it comes also to ask and to come back to the first question of the regulated entity and whether they are willing or not, and the clash of cultures, in most cases, it's more than that, in the sense that it might be that, but it's also a capacity, the capacity requirement for anything from an SME to a large tech, biotech, whatever it is, company, to actually provide this knowledge, to generate this knowledge, to record it, to share it with the regulator, is fundamental, and it's critical. And we haven't seen a lot of studies out there. There's a huge gap in our academic scholarship because there aren't a lot of studies out there. I can literally probably think of some on the fingers on one hand that have actually looked into investigating more these capacity deficits and the institutional arrangements that need to happen for this degree of innovation to be more than just, you know, the toolkits that we have beforehand. I know that Malcolm, for instance, Professor Malcolm Sparrow is in the audience, and I recently purchased his COVID book with the whole arrangement of different types of interventions. And ultimately, the point that he's made throughout the book, I can't remember where, that, you know, I mean, we can call them whatever we call them, unless to suit us, but unless we see those changes happen, they are just some approaches that sometimes shift terminology.
Yeah, thank you, Irina. I'd like to ask Ingrid to have a comment that maybe I can also respond, not taking some burden from Irina. So if Ingrid was writing about the politics of it all, there is power in it, but I did see you mentioning kind of a clause in the end, the politics is important, but I'm not dealing with it here. So you don't have to answer unless you want to say some few words just to conclude, because we are towards the end of our talk. So.
Yeah. So absolutely, politics is important, and I kind of left it as the final ... in the sense that, especially when it comes to, if we are to treat these regulatory approaches as really novel regulatory approaches, innovations in this area, then we need to also take into consideration who is advocating them, who benefits and who loses from these particular arrangements. And I can already think, for instance, coming back to one of my previous examples, when it comes to small and medium enterprises that are very innovative in a lot of situations, when it comes to, for instance, technological innovation, digital technology innovations, they are very much present, but the capacity that they have to be active, involved participants in these types of new regulatory arrangements is considerably different, and the capacity is a lot more limited. And I've conducted research with IoT SMEs, for instance, and this is what came out of those interactions with those SMEs. than if you are a medium to large enterprise operating in this space, or of course the giants.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ingrid. Thank you very much for excellent presentation, and good luck with your work and your research, and thank you all for your participation. Looking forward to see you in the next seminar, which will be announced over the regulation network. Good day to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.